Welcome to a deep dive into modern history, exploring the bloody price of Middle Eastern peace. Deep within the tranquil woods of Maryland, an isolated rustic cabin changed the entire world. Thousands of miles away, the scorching Sinai Desert was heavily soaked in the blood of fallen soldiers. 3 weary leaders met in absolute secrecy, carrying the immense weight of their bleeding nations. Could 13 agonizing days of fierce mental warfare truly end decades of bitter hatred? For decades, the very concept of peace in the Middle East was considered an absolute impossibility. A relentless cycle of violence defined the region, leaving countless families shattered and broken. The core belief across the entire Arab world was that the Jewish state simply had no right to exist. Any attempt at negotiation or compromise was immediately branded as unforgivable treason. On the opposing side, Israel viewed its newly conquered territories as vital strategic buffers. The vast and arid Sinai Peninsula was a critical shield, bought with the heavy price of young blood. Returning this massive expanse of land was widely seen as an act of national suicide. It felt as though an inescapable curse of eternal hatred had settled over the desert sands. Generations grew up knowing nothing but the deafening roar of relentless artillery fire. The devastating wars of 1948 and 1967 only deepened the divide. Bitter memories of loss fueled a raging fire of resentment that seemed impossible to extinguish. Both sides were securely locked in a desperate struggle for pure survival and historical justice. Diplomacy remained completely frozen, while military machines continued to expand rapidly. Superpowers fueled the conflict from the shadows, supplying massive arsenals to their chosen allies. The entire world watched in absolute terror as the Middle East repeatedly pushed toward the brink. No leader dared to speak of lasting harmony, fearing a violent backlash from their own people. The borders were heavily fortified with barbed wire, landmines, and heavily armed military patrols. Historical records show the animosity was deeply ingrained in regional education systems. Every new generation inherited the profound trauma and the unyielding prejudice of their ancestors. The scorching sun beat down on the landscape, completely scarred by the heavy tracks of combat vehicles. Countless mothers on both sides of the border wept for sons who would never return home. It was a brutal stalemate of mutual destruction, where victory was always measured in body counts. Yet, the Yom Kippur War of 1973 would drastically alter this rigid dynamic. The massive surprise attack shattered Israel's long-held illusion of absolute invincibility. Though Israel repelled the violent invasion, the psychological damage was incredibly severe. Both nations were exhausted, their economies bleeding heavily from the high cost of combat. The massive toll of human lives finally forced a radical and highly controversial shift. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat looked upon his ruined nation and recognized a grim reality. Prolonged warfare would completely drain the remaining lifeblood from his struggling country. He knew that winning battles could never secure a prosperous future for the Egyptian people. In a shocking move in 1977, Sadat made a highly unprecedented decision. He boarded a flight and traveled directly into the very heart of the enemy territory. The entire globe watched in absolute disbelief as he stepped onto the tarmac in Jerusalem. He stood proudly before the Israeli parliament, extending a controversial olive branch. His bold and unexpected speech proposed a fascinating paradox that challenged the old order. If you led a grieving nation, would you dare to walk directly into the enemy's lair? Sadat offered to formally recognize Israel, shattering a decades-old Arab political taboo. In exchange, he demanded the complete and total return of the strategic Sinai Peninsula. It was a simple yet profound proposition, trading conquered territory for lasting security. However, Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin was a hardened and deeply conservative leader. He spent his entire life fiercely fighting for the survival and expansion of the Jewish homeland. Begin viewed the vast Sinai Desert as an absolute necessity for robust national defense. He was deeply suspicious of Sadat's true motives, fearing a cleverly disguised and deadly trap. The publicized visit generated massive hope, but the actual negotiations quickly stalled. Deeply rooted mistrust and decades of bloody history created an impenetrable barrier. Radical Arab nations furiously condemned Sadat, labeling his journey as ultimate treason. They aggressively severed ties and actively plotted to completely isolate the Egyptian state. Meanwhile, hardline Israeli factions vehemently protested any surrender of the captured land. The beautiful momentum of the historic Jerusalem visit was rapidly fading into despair. The fragile window for a peaceful resolution was closing fast as domestic pressures mounted. It became blindingly clear that these two bitter adversaries could never agree on their own. They urgently needed a powerful external force to actively bridge the massive divide. The entire peace process was dangerously teetering on the edge of a catastrophic collapse. Another devastating war in the Middle East seemed to be an almost unavoidable tragedy. The global economy, heavily dependent on regional oil, braced for a massive and sudden shock. Recognizing the severe global threat, the United States government decided to intervene directly. The stage was set for one of the most intense diplomatic showdowns in modern human history. In the autumn of 1978, President Jimmy Carter made a daring political move. He invited both stubborn leaders to the highly secluded Camp David presidential retreat. Hidden deep in the Maryland woods, the rustic cabins provided an extremely isolated environment. Carter's strategy was to completely remove the aggressive media and the intense public pressure. For 13 agonizing days, the psychological warfare inside the closed rooms was suffocating. Begin adamantly refused to dismantle the Jewish civilian settlements within the Sinai Desert. Sadat grew increasingly furious, repeatedly threatening to pack his bags and abandon the summit. The animosity between the two men was so severe, they eventually refused to speak face-to-face. President Carter was forced to act as a tireless shuttle between their separate wooden cabins. He aggressively utilized every tool at his disposal, from gentle persuasion to severe threats. He warned both leaders that a sudden failure would permanently destroy their American alliance. Carter carefully presented detailed military maps, arguing over every single inch of the sand. The historic negotiations were repeatedly pushed to the absolute brink of total failure. National pride collided violently with historical trauma and the desperate need for security. To sweeten the difficult deal, Carter offered an unprecedented package of massive assistance. Billions of dollars in advanced military aid were promised to both of the exhausted nations. Would you compromise your deepest national beliefs if a massive fortune was placed on the table? The American taxpayer essentially became the ultimate financial guarantor of this fragile peace. Slowly, the thick walls of stubbornness began to show very tiny but highly significant cracks. Carter appealed to Begin's deep religious faith and his strong desire to protect his grandchildren. He signed dozens of photographs for Begin's family, heavily softening the tough Israeli's heart. He convinced Sadat that regaining the Sinai was a far greater victory than fighting endless wars. The delicate drafting process continued very late into the quiet and freezing autumn nights. Every single comma and chosen word was aggressively debated by the weary legal advisors. The physical and mental toll on all three aging leaders was becoming incredibly obvious. Yet the historical gravity of the unique moment kept them anchored to the negotiation table. They were desperately trying to completely rewrite the bloody destiny of the volatile region. Finally, after nearly 2 weeks of exhaustion, a highly fragile consensus was miraculously reached. The strategic buffer of the Sinai would be completely demilitarized and returned back to Egypt. In return, Egypt would officially become the first Arab state to formally recognize Israel. A truly historic compromise was officially signed on the bright lawns of the American White House. The Camp David Accords finally proved that the rigid structure of hatred could be entirely broken. Israel finally secured a peaceful southern border, greatly reducing its military vulnerability. Egypt successfully reclaimed its lost territory and received massive American financial support. The world breathed a massive sigh of relief as the severe threat of a regional war quickly diminished. However, this incredible diplomatic triumph carried an exceptionally dark and bloody price tag. Radical factions in the Arab world never forgave Anwar Sadat for his controversial peace treaty. He was aggressively branded a wicked traitor who completely abandoned the Palestinian cause. On a tragic day in 1981, extreme violence finally caught up with him. During a military parade in Cairo, radical assassins violently took his life. The visionary leader who courageously walked into the enemy camp was silenced forever. His shocking death served as a very brutal reminder of the extreme cost of compromise. Menachem Begin was left deeply scarred, completely isolating himself in his final years. Jimmy Carter lost his re-election bid, despite achieving this massive diplomatic win. The heavy political fallout clearly showed that making peace is far harder than making war. The historic Camp David Accords established a completely new diplomatic paradigm. It proved that the absolute worst of enemies could eventually find a common middle ground. Egypt and Israel have officially maintained their cold but highly stable border ever since. However, the broader regional conflict was tragically far from reaching a final conclusion. The deeply sensitive Palestinian issue was largely ignored and left completely unresolved. This massive oversight created a bleeding wound that continues to cause endless suffering today. Future generations would forcefully inherit the exact same cycles of profound desperation. The peace achieved at Camp David was a monumental victory for international statesmanship. Yet it remains a haunting reminder that true harmony demands incredible sacrifice. Sometimes the brave men who construct the delicate bridges do not survive to cross them safely. The Camp David Accords remain a profound historical paradox, bringing peace while leaving deep scars. Was this treaty a brave diplomatic triumph or a tragic betrayal? Share your thoughts below. If you enjoyed this deep historical analysis, please like this video, share it, and subscribe.